William Shakespeare, playwright, poet, and the myth. Now, everyone has a strong opinion about William Shakespeare. Your English teachers often will have a strong positive opinion about Shakespeare, while most students, with the exception of very few, feel very strongly a negative feel about William Shakespeare. But why? The common complaint that students give is that it's really difficult to understand, that he uses really old words and it's super unrelatable to today. He tells stories of kings and queens, betrayal and fights and wars, which for many students means absolutely nothing to their daily high school life. They're not wrong. Shakespeare's plays are almost over 400 years old. They've been studied for just as long. But why are we so interested in this man? Well, let's take a look at who he was as a person. We can start off with this quote: "We know what we are, but not what we may be." And Shakespeare probably never expected to be read 400 years later by students in a grade 11 classroom. So who was Shakespeare? Here are a few things that we actually know for sure. That he was baptized on April 26th, 1564. And you can see by this inscription by a priest that on the 26th, Guilelmus Filius Johannes Shakespeare. Now those chicken scratches do show us that William, son of John Shakespeare, was baptized on that very date. And that's the first time Will's name shows up anywhere. We also have the hard fact that he died on April 23rd, 1616. Now we don't know how he died, we don't know all the details, but we do have a date of death. One other document that we have that we know for sure was is his will. What would you leave in your last will and testament? What would you leave to your family? Your wife, anybody that's special to you, and especially Shakespeare, a well-known author, poet, playwright. What would he leave behind? In this document, people have really spent a lot of time analyzing what was mentioned and what was left to who. So the best known passage from this will is the bequest to his wife. He gave her his second best bed. Now many people have spent a lot of time analyzing what that means. And why would he give Anne Hathaway his second best bed? Did they not get along? Was the second best bed actually better than the first best bed? Meanwhile, it was his son-in-law, John Hall, and William's daughter, Susanna, who were left with the rest of the goods, chattels, leases, plate, jewels, and household stuff whatsoever. Many have debated why William should leave his wife his second best bed, and other people are really questioning why someone as popular as Shakespeare would not have left books or any proof of his writing in his will. You may already have your opinion about how you feel about Shakespeare, but there are very few things that we know absolutely about the man. We basically went through all of them. But when we look at more of the facts, then maybe we can try to analyze what that meant. So we take a look at his love and his marriage. We know for a fact that he was married to Anne Hathaway in 1582. It's interesting to note that there was a huge age difference between the two. One was 18 and the other was 26. Nowadays, an 8-year age gap may be not so accepted, but back then, perhaps it was. What makes this even more interesting is that who you assume to be 26 may be wrong. Shakespeare was 18. Anne was 26. Now, if you take a look at their firstborn, Susanna, and when she was born, you will notice that it was only 6 months after they were married, which may mean that Anne and Shakespeare may have had some sort of relationship. Other facts that we know for sure about Shakespeare was that he was an actor, because his name does appear on a list of actors for the Lord Chamberlain's Men in London. He was also an instrumental part of the creation of the Globe Theatre, where many of his plays were performed. So we know that he was involved in plays, in playwriting, and for at least some time was an actor. As far as his writing, nothing has survived. There is absolutely no manuscript, no scribbles, no nothing. We only get these signatures. Most of these signatures come from his last will and testament. Whoever Shakespeare was, he was well known for 4 types of writing. Poems called sonnets. He has over 150 of them attributed to his name. He wrote comedies, tragedies, and histories. It's very simple to see the difference between each one. A comedy, everyone gets married in the end. The tragedy, everyone dies in the end. Histories are retelling stories of old English kings. Now back then, histories would have been the most popular of the plays performed, whereas today, his tragedies seem to have a more eternal theme to them and are often still read in schools today. Now, what did he look like? The Droeshout portrait in 1623 is the first official engraving of Shakespeare's face. Problem is, it was 7 years after he had died. So how do we know that this picture of him that's been popularized and spread around actually looks anything like him? Well, in the introduction of the first folio, Ben Jonson, who wrote the introduction, he would have known Shakespeare while he was alive. They were contemporaries. They both were poets at the time. So it's very likely that Ben and Will would have known each other. And he writes, "Oh, could he have drawn his wit as well in phrase as he hath hit his face?" He's basically saying, if only the artist had drawn his intelligence as well as he had drawn his face. Basically giving props to the artist for doing such a good job with his face. And that is the only evidence that we have that this actually looks anything like him. Because all other photos that come thereafter, Chando's portrait, the sculpture next to his burial, all of these photos come from after his death. Up to 200 years later. Some of them are similar, some of them are incredibly different. The one thing they have in common is they were all painted after his death, with the possible exception of one. The Saunders portrait. Now this painting was actually found with a family in Nepean. This may be Shakespeare in his 20s. Carbon dating seems to agree that this would coincide when Shakespeare was approximately 26. However, there is no way to make sure that this is William Shakespeare. There's no way to actually tell if it's actually him. The only evidence we have is his name is inscribed on the back, but that could have been inscribed at any time. We do know that Saunders, the one who painted it, would have known Shakespeare during his life and in his 20s, as they were both part of the Lord Chamberlain's men. So there is proof that this may be the earliest photograph of Shakespeare, and maybe one of the only photos of him painted during his life. One final thing we can take a look at to understand who Shakespeare was. Take a look at what he put on his tombstone. He decided to have this: "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man who spares these stones, and cursed be he who moves my bones." It is interesting to note what type of personality would put a curse on their own tombstone. Now, I'm not sure if I would do the same, but Shakespeare did. It goes to show what sort of obsession he may have had on not knowing what happened to his body afterwards. It's a person that doesn't quite know all the answers about life, about death. And these are themes that can be seen throughout all of his works. So a little more on his legacy. We often credit Shakespeare with inventing a bunch of words. The fact is, he probably didn't invent every single one of these words. He just is the first one to put it on paper, and therefore gets the credit. Okay, but how does Shakespeare make any sense? I understand a lot of these words, and the way that he even structures the sentences don't always make a lot of sense. But this is why we still read him. We need to take the time to actually understand the structure. We need to think about what is being said, which isn't something that we could always do with all the other books that we've read this year. One thing to take a look at is sometimes he inverts the subject and verb. So normally you would say he goes. Shakespeare plays with that and he goes he instead. Sometimes the object is placed before the verb and the subject, which isn't normal for us. So instead of saying I hit him, Shakespeare would sometimes say him I hit. There's also the separation of words and interruptions. When the ambitious Norway combated. And this is the difficulty with reading Shakespeare. You need to almost deconstruct most of the things that are being said to fully understand the message, the themes, and the characters. So there is some value to still read Shakespeare today. And even though it will be difficult, and you may disagree with everything that's been said, give it a try. Attack Shakespeare with an open mind. So even if we don't know a whole lot about who Shakespeare was, what we do still have are the words. And the words are what have lived on for so long.